What if some of the foods you barely notice in your kitchen are actually the kinds of foods that have been valued for healthy eating for centuries? Not exotic superfoods, not expensive supplements, not powders with complicated names. Just beans, grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and herbs. That might sound almost too simple, but think about this. For centuries, many monks lived without supermarkets, protein powders, vitamin supplements, or modern health foods. Their meals were shaped by what they could grow, harvest, store, and prepare themselves. And yet, when you look at the traditional foods found in many monastery kitchens, a surprising pattern begins to appear. Simple ingredients, whole foods, seasonal produce, and foods eaten consistently rather than occasionally. Now, this doesn't mean monks discovered some secret formula for living forever, and it certainly doesn't mean that every monk ate the same way. Monasteries existed in different countries, climates, and centuries, so their diets varied enormously. But here's what makes their food traditions interesting. Many of the basic foods they relied on are still considered valuable parts of a healthy diet today. Foods rich in fiber, foods containing healthy fats, foods packed with vitamins, minerals, and plant compounds, and foods that don't need a fancy health claim on the package to be useful. So maybe the interesting question isn't, which one food made monks healthy? Maybe it's this: what can we learn from the kinds of foods they repeatedly put on the table? Because as we go through these 20 monastery foods, you'll probably recognize many of them. You may even have several sitting in your kitchen right now. And that's where this gets interesting, because the real lesson may not be hidden inside one miraculous ingredient. It may be hidden in the pattern. At number 20, we have a food that probably doesn't look very exciting at first. Barley. It's not trendy. You don't usually see it promoted as the latest miracle superfood. And that's exactly what makes its place in traditional monastery kitchens so interesting. For many monks, barley simply made sense. It was filling, versatile, and could be stored for long periods. In a monastery where food had to be carefully managed through changing seasons, having a dependable grain that could sit in storage and still be useful months later was incredibly valuable. And barley wasn't just practical. It's also a good source of fiber, which can help you feel full and supports a healthy digestive system. But here's the interesting part. The monks weren't choosing barley because they had nutrition labels telling them how much fiber it contained. They were choosing it because it worked. It could be grown, stored, cooked, and turned into simple meals again and again. And that reveals the first pattern you'll see throughout this list. The foods in traditional monastery kitchens weren't necessarily rare or expensive. They were dependable, they were available, and they could become part of everyday life. That's a very different idea from the way we often think about healthy food today. We tend to look for the newest ingredient with the most impressive reputation. But sometimes, the foods worth paying attention to are the ones people have been able to rely on for generations. And barley was one of them. But don't get too comfortable with the ordinary foods just yet, because the next food takes this idea even further. It could grow in an astonishing range of environments, became a staple across countless traditional diets, and maybe one of the most familiar foods on this entire list. And you probably already have it in your kitchen. At number 19, we have another food that might seem almost too ordinary to deserve a place on this list. Oats. Today, they're mostly associated with breakfast. A warm bowl of oatmeal, maybe some fruit, maybe a handful of nuts. Simple, but that's exactly the point. Long before overnight oats and modern breakfast recipes, oats were valued for something much less glamorous. They were dependable. They were easy to prepare, easy to combine with other ingredients, and could turn into a warm, satisfying meal with very little effort. For a simple monastic kitchen, that kind of food was useful. And oats have another quality that makes them interesting today. They're naturally rich in fiber, which can help with fullness and supports a healthy digestive system. So instead of eating a breakfast that leaves you searching for another snack shortly afterward, a bowl built around a fiber-rich food can be much more satisfying. And that leads to another lesson hidden in these traditional foods. Healthy eating doesn't always mean adding more foods to your diet. Sometimes it means choosing food that satisfy you with less fuss. That's one reason oats have remained so useful for generations. They're humble, they're inexpensive, and they don't need a complicated recipe to become a meal. But there's something else worth noticing. When you look at foods like barley and oats together, a pattern is already beginning to emerge. The foods don't need to be impressive. They need to be useful. And that idea becomes even more interesting with the next food, because the next one isn't just a simple staple. It has been feeding people for thousands of years, and entire traditional diets have been built around it. And chances are you've eaten it many times yourself. At number 18, we have a food that may be small, but has played a surprisingly big role in traditional diets around the world. Lentils. They don't look impressive. They're small, inexpensive, and they certainly don't have a glamorous reputation of many modern superfoods. But for a monastery kitchen, lentils had something far more important than glamour. They were practical. They could be stored for long periods, cooked into simple meals, and provided both plant protein and fiber. And imagine the challenge of feeding an entire community every day without supermarkets, refrigerators, or packaged convenience foods. You wouldn't want ingredients that were difficult to store or complicated to prepare. You want foods that could sit in the pantry, be pulled out when needed, and become a satisfying meal. Lentils fit that job remarkably well. They could become a hearty soup, a thick stew, or they could be combined with grains and vegetables to make a much more substantial meal. And there's an important lesson hiding here. A food doesn't have to be exciting to be useful. In fact, a food you eat once isn't what defines your diet. It's the food you come back to again and again. That's what makes lentils so interesting. They weren't exotic. They weren't expensive. They didn't need clever marketing. They simply worked. And perhaps that's part of the reason they've remained a staple in traditional diets for so long. But now we've reached an interesting point in the list. Barley gave us a dependable grain. Oats showed us the value of a satisfying staple. And lentils brought something different to the table. But the next food could transform an otherwise simple meal in a completely different way. And unlike lentils, its most interesting quality isn't primarily about protein. It's something monks would have appreciated for a very different reason. Number 17, chickpeas. At number 17, we have a food that may be one of the most versatile ingredients on this entire list. Chickpeas. Today, you might know them from hummus, salads, curries, or roasted snacks, but their usefulness goes much further back than modern recipes. For centuries, chickpeas have been a practical staple in many traditional kitchens because one simple ingredient could become an entirely different meal depending on what was available. And that would have been especially useful in a monastery. Imagine having a pantry stocked with dried chickpeas. One day, they could become a thick, hearty stew. Another day, they could be mashed into a spread. They could be combined with grains, mixed with vegetables, or cooked with herbs and simple seasonings. One ingredient. Completely different meals. That's the real strength of chickpeas. And nutritionally, they bring something useful to the table too. Chickpeas provide plant protein and fiber, making them a satisfying addition to many meals. But the bigger lesson here isn't just about protein or fiber. It's about versatility. When one basic ingredient can work across so many different meals, eating simply becomes much easier. You don't need a pantry full of specialized health foods. You need a few ingredients that can actually earn their place in your kitchen. And that's something the traditional monastery approach got right. The best everyday foods weren't necessarily the most impressive. They were the ones you could keep coming back to. Chickpeas were one of those foods. And we're only at number 17, because the next food takes this idea of feeding an entire community even further. It wasn't just versatile. It became one of the great staples of traditional diets, and you've almost certainly eaten it yourself. At number 16, we have a food that looks incredibly ordinary, but historically, it was anything but unimportant. Fava beans. Long before modern protein powders and packaged health foods, broad beans were a familiar staple in parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. And for communities that needed to feed themselves through changing seasons, that made them incredibly valuable. Fava beans could be dried and stored. They could be cooked into soups and stews. And they could be combined with grains, vegetables, herbs, or a little oil to create a much more substantial meal. In other words, they weren't just another ingredient. They were a dependable source of food when fresh produce wasn't always available. And that matters when you imagine life inside a traditional monastery. A monastery wasn't simply a place where people ate whatever happened to be available that day. Food had to be grown, stored, preserved, prepared, and carefully managed. A crop that could be harvested and then kept for later could become extremely valuable. Fava beans also provide plant protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals, making them a useful part of a varied diet. But the most interesting thing about them may be something much simpler. They could help turn basic ingredients into a real meal. And that brings us to another pattern in this list. The foods that mattered most weren't necessarily the foods with the biggest reputation. They were the foods that could survive, store well, and keep showing up on the table. Fava beans did exactly that, and we've now reached the halfway point of our journey. But the next food takes us in a completely different direction, because it wasn't valued mainly because it could sit in a pantry for months. It was valued because of what it could bring to a meal almost immediately. And you may already have this one growing in your kitchen, or even on your windowsill. At number 15, we have a vegetable that could sit quietly in a monastery cellar long after the summer garden had disappeared. Cabbage. It doesn't look like a superfood. It isn't exotic, and there's nothing particularly glamorous about it. But for people living before modern supermarkets and year-round refrigeration, cabbage had something incredibly valuable. It could help bridge the gap between one season and the next. Cabbage tolerated cooler conditions and could be stored or preserved, which meant it could remain useful when fresh vegetables became much harder to find. And imagine what that meant during winter. Your garden wasn't producing much. Fresh greens weren't available whenever you wanted them, and there was no supermarket waiting around the corner. You had to rely on what you'd grown, stored, or preserved months earlier. That's where cabbage became more than just another vegetable. It could be added to soups and stews, combined with grains and legumes, or preserved so it could be eaten later. And that leads to a fascinating idea that modern food culture has largely made unnecessary. Seasonal eating. When something was growing, you ate it. When there was plenty, you preserved it. And when winter arrived, you relied on what you'd managed to save. Cabbage fit beautifully into that cycle. And there's a lesson here that goes beyond cabbage. Today, we often think healthy eating means finding the perfect ingredients. But traditional diets were often built around a much simpler question. What can we grow, preserve, and eat again and again? Cabbage was one of those answers. Not glamorous, not expensive, just incredibly useful. And the next food is even more interesting, because unlike cabbage, it wasn't mainly valued for lasting through the winter. It was valued for something that could completely change the flavor of an otherwise simple meal. And once you know what it is, you'll probably realize you've been overlooking it too. At number 14, we have something you probably already have sitting in your kitchen, the humble onion. It might be one of the most ordinary foods imaginable, but in a traditional monastery kitchen, an onion could do something surprisingly important. It could make a simple meal taste like a completely different meal. Imagine a basic pot of beans, lentils, barley, or vegetables. The ingredients are nutritious. They're filling. But without much else, the meal could become repetitive. Then you add onions, cook them slowly, and suddenly you get sweetness, aroma, and depth of flavor. That's incredibly useful when your kitchen doesn't have packaged sauces, instant flavorings, or an endless supply of ingredients. Onions would go into soups, stews, grains, vegetables, and countless other dishes. They were relatively inexpensive, easy to store, and useful throughout much of the year. But here's the bigger lesson. Healthy eating doesn't have to mean boring eating. One reason people struggle with simple diets is that they imagine healthy means plain chicken, steamed vegetables, and food with no flavor. Traditional cooks had another solution. They didn't need to choose between simple and flavorful. They could build flavor from the ingredients they already had. Onions, herbs, garlic, spices. A few basic ingredients could completely transform an otherwise ordinary meal. And that matters because a diet is much easier to stick with when the food is something you actually enjoy eating. So the onion wasn't necessarily the star of the meal. It was the ingredient that helped everything else shine. And the next food has an even more fascinating story, because it wasn't just used to make food taste better. For centuries, people also turned to it for another reason entirely. And that history is about to take us from the kitchen into the world of traditional remedies. At number 13, we have another ingredient that probably doesn't look very impressive on its own. Garlic. Small, strong-smelling, and incredibly ordinary. Yet for centuries, garlic has appeared in traditional kitchens across many different cultures. And when you think about the kind of meals we've been talking about, it's easy to understand why. Imagine a pot of beans, lentils, grains, or vegetables. The ingredients are simple. The meal is nutritious, but eat the same basic ingredients often enough, and you need a way to keep them interesting. Garlic could completely change the experience. A few cloves could transform a plain pot of vegetables. It could deepen a soup, add character to a stew, or bring a much stronger flavor to an otherwise simple meal. And because garlic could be grown and stored, it was useful in the kitchen long after it had been harvested. But garlic has another reason it remains interesting today. It's a plant food containing naturally occurring compounds that researchers have studied for various potential health effects. That doesn't make garlic a miracle cure. And it certainly doesn't mean that eating more garlic automatically makes you healthier. But there's something much more interesting happening here. Look at the foods we've covered so far. Barley, oats, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, cabbage, onions, and now garlic. At first, they might look like a random collection of ordinary foods, but there's a pattern. They're not magical ingredients. They're simple plant foods that can be combined in countless ways and become part of everyday meals. And that's perhaps the most useful lesson from the monastery kitchen. The goal wasn't necessarily to find one perfect food. It was to build meals of a variety of ordinary foods that could be grown, stored, prepared, and enjoyed regularly. That's a very different way of thinking about healthy eating. Instead of asking, what's the one food I should be eating? Maybe the better question is, how many different whole foods can I regularly bring to the table? And now we're leaving the monastery kitchen for a moment, because the next food grew in the orchard, and unlike garlic or onions, it brought something naturally sweet to the table. And its role in traditional diets was about to become much more interesting than simply satisfying a sweet tooth. At number 12, we leave the vegetable garden and step into the orchard. Apples. For a monastery with access to fruit trees, apples could be incredibly valuable, not simply because they could be eaten fresh, but because a good harvest didn't have to disappear when the season ended. Apples could be dried, cooked, stored, or turned into simple preparations that extended their usefulness well beyond the picking season. And in a world without supermarkets, refrigeration, and year-round produce, that mattered. Imagine an orchard producing far more apples than a community could possibly eat at once. Today, that might seem like a problem. But traditional communities had another question. How can we make this harvest last? That question changed the way people thought about food. When something was abundant, you didn't simply consume it and move on. You preserved it. Apples also brought something naturally sweet to a diet built largely around grains, vegetables, legumes, and herbs. A fresh apple provided water, fiber, and naturally occurring plant compounds, while its natural sweetness made it feel like a treat without needing an elaborate dessert. Of course, apples weren't some secret answer to aging. Their real importance was much simpler. They were useful. They could be eaten fresh. They could be cooked. They could be combined with other foods. And they could be saved for later. Once again, the pattern is becoming clearer. Simple food, seasonal abundance, minimal waste. The monastery kitchen wasn't necessarily about finding exotic ingredients. It was about getting the greatest possible use from what the land provided. And that brings us to an even bigger question. What happens when the harvest is over? Because some traditional foods weren't just meant to survive for a few extra weeks. They were designed to last through entire seasons. And the next food may be one of the clearest examples of that idea. At number 11, we have a food that looks small, but a surprisingly small amount can add a lot to a simple meal. Walnuts. For traditional monastery kitchens, walnuts had an obvious advantage. They were compact, durable, and easy to store. You didn't need a complicated recipe. You could crack them open and eat them as they were, add them to bread or porridge, or use them to make an otherwise simple meal richer and more satisfying. And nutritionally, walnuts are interesting because they contain healthy fats, some protein, fiber, and other plant nutrients. That means a relatively small serving can bring quite a bit of nourishment to the table. And think about how useful that could be in a traditional food system. Fresh produce had seasons. Some foods were difficult to preserve. But nuts could be harvested, stored, and brought out when needed. They were almost like a small package of food that nature had already prepared for you. And that's what makes walnuts different from some of the foods we've covered so far. They weren't just another ingredient for a meal. They were a way of storing nourishment in a compact form. And once again, we're seeing something important about traditional diets. The goal wasn't always to eat more. Sometimes it was to choose foods that could provide more nourishment in a smaller amount. Walnuts weren't a miracle food. They were simply another useful piece of a varied diet. And we're now getting close to the top 10. The next food is much smaller than a walnut, and you might barely notice it when it's sitting on your plate. But traditional cultures have valued this tiny ingredient for centuries, and it could completely change the character of a meal. We've reached the top 10. And at number 10, we have one of the smallest foods on this entire list. Flaxseed. Tiny, plain, easy to overlook. But flax was far more useful than its appearance might suggest. The plant itself was valuable for its fiber, which could be used to make linen, and its seeds had another use. They could become food and cooking oil. Historical evidence shows that flax was an important crop in medieval Europe, where its oil-rich seeds had practical uses in cooking. And that makes flaxseed an interesting addition to our list. You need to build an entire meal around it. A small amount could be incorporated into something as simple as bread or porridge, adding another plant food to an otherwise basic meal. Nutritionally, flaxseed contains fiber and alpha-linolenic acid, a plant-based omega-3 fat, along with other naturally occurring compounds. But the bigger lesson isn't that flaxseed is some magical health ingredient. It isn't. The interesting part is how small contributions can add up. Think about the meals we've been building throughout this list. A grain, some legumes, a vegetable, a little fruit, a handful of nuts, and now a few seeds. No single ingredient has to do everything. Different foods can contribute different things. And that may be one of the most useful lessons hidden in these traditional food systems. Healthy eating doesn't always have to involve a dramatic transformation. Sometimes, it's simply about creating meals from a wider variety of ordinary foods. And flaxseed is a perfect example of that philosophy. Small, easy to overlook, but useful enough to earn its place. And now we've entered the top 10. The next food is completely different. It wasn't a seed, a grain, or a vegetable. It became one of the most important ingredients for adding both flavor and preservation to traditional food, and its story goes back thousands of years. At number 9, we have something that may seem less like a food and more like a simple kitchen ingredient. Olive oil. But in Mediterranean regions, olive oil could be much more than something you poured into a pan. Olive trees were well suited to the climate, and their fruit could be harvested and pressed into an oil that could be stored and used throughout the year. That made olive oil incredibly useful in a traditional kitchen. It could be used to cook vegetables, dress simple salads, add richness to grains and legumes, or bring together a meal made from otherwise humble ingredients. And there's something fascinating about that. When your food is simple, the quality of a few basic ingredients becomes much more noticeable. Imagine a bowl of beans, some cooked vegetables, a few herbs, and a little olive oil. None of those ingredients sounds particularly exciting on its own. Together, they can become a completely different meal. And that's an important lesson. More isn't automatically better. Olive oil is energy dense, so you don't need huge amounts to make a difference. A little can add flavor, richness, and texture without requiring complicated sauces or heavily processed toppings. And this brings us back to the bigger pattern we've been discovering. The monastery kitchen wasn't necessarily about finding one perfect ingredient. It was about choosing a handful of simple ingredients that work together. A little olive oil, some vegetables, a few beans, some herbs, and suddenly an ordinary meal becomes something satisfying. That's the real power of a simple kitchen. And now we're entering the final stretch. Because olive oil may have helped bring a meal together, but the next food was something even more fundamental. It wasn't simply something added to the meal. It could form the foundation of the meal itself. And once you discover what it is, you'll understand why it appears in so many traditional food cultures around the world. At number 8, we come to a food that was far more than something placed beside a meal: whole grain bread. For many monastery communities, bread could be a basic part of daily life. It was practical, filling, easy to combine with other foods, and could be made from grains that were already available. But there's an important distinction here. Not all bread is created the same way. When bread is made from whole or less refined grains, more of the original grain remains. That generally means more fiber and naturally occurring nutrients than you would get from highly refined bread. And this reveals an important lesson. The form of a food matters. Take the same basic grain. It can be ground and turned into a simple loaf that retains much of the original grain. Or it can be heavily refined, removing parts of the grain before becoming a very different kind of product. Both may be called bread, but nutritionally, they're not necessarily the same. For traditional communities, bread also had another advantage. It could turn a relatively simple grain into something that was easy to divide, serve, store, and combine with whatever else was available. The process could be remarkably straightforward. Take the grain, grind it, bake it, eat it, then pair it with vegetables, beans, herbs, oil, or whatever the season provided. Now, that doesn't mean every traditional loaf was automatically healthier than every modern loaf. It simply shows us something worth remembering. A food's original ingredient isn't the whole story. How that food is processed can matter too. And we've now reached the final stretch of our list, because the next food introduces another fascinating transformation. It wasn't simply eaten fresh. Time itself changed it, and that transformation made it possible to preserve food, alter its flavor, and create something remarkably different from the original ingredient. At number 7, we come to something that sounds surprisingly modern, even though people were preserving food this way long before refrigerators existed. Fermented vegetables. Today, fermentation is often presented as a trendy health practice. You hear about sauerkraut, kimchi, pickled vegetables, and other fermented foods whenever people talk about gut health. But for traditional communities, fermentation wasn't originally about following a wellness trend. It was about making food last. Imagine harvesting a large amount of cabbage or another vegetable during the growing season. You can't simply put it in a refrigerator and expect it to stay fresh for months. So you need another solution. You preserve it. Fermentation was one of the ways people could do that, through the activity of microorganisms. Vegetables could be transformed into foods with a longer shelf life and a completely different flavor and texture. And for communities that relied heavily on seasonal harvests, that could be incredibly useful. Instead of watching a large harvest spoil, part of it could be preserved for later, which leads to three very simple questions. How do we stop good food from going to waste? How do we make the harvest last? How do we turn what we have today into food we can use tomorrow? Those questions may sound practical rather than nutritional, but that's what makes traditional food systems so fascinating. People weren't necessarily trying to invent health foods. They were solving everyday problems. And centuries later, fermentation has attracted new scientific interest because of the microorganisms and compounds involved in the process, as well as questions about its effect on the gut and overall health. But the evidence varies considerably depending on the specific fermented food and how it is made. So the lesson isn't, fermented vegetables are a miracle food. It's much simpler. A preservation technique developed out of necessity eventually became something modern nutrition researchers became interested in for entirely different reasons. And that's one of the most fascinating patterns in traditional food. Sometimes people solve a practical problem first, and only centuries later do we begin to understand some of the other things happening along the way. But vegetables weren't the only foods people learned to transform. The next food begins with something completely different. It starts with milk, and what happened to that milk turned it into one of the most important traditional foods in many cultures. At number 6, we move from the garden and grain store into another part of traditional monastery life, cultured dairy, including yogurt. Now, there's an important detail here. Not every monastery had access to dairy. Some communities kept animals and had milk available, while others lived in regions where dairy was less common. Religious rules could also determine when animal products were permitted. So we're not saying every monk was eating yogurt every morning, but where dairy was available, people had a problem to solve. Fresh milk doesn't stay fresh forever, so they learned to transform it. Through culturing, milk could become thicker, tangier, and completely different in texture and flavor. And that transformation could make a highly perishable ingredient much more useful as part of a traditional food system. Cultured dairy also provides protein and other nutrients, making it a useful addition to a simple meal. But the most interesting part isn't just nutrition, it's the transformation itself. Think about what happened. Milk went in. A completely different food came out. And that reveals another important lesson from traditional kitchens. People didn't always eat ingredients exactly as they found them. They learned how to preserve them, transform them, and make them more useful. Today, yogurt is often marketed as a modern health food. But the basic practice of culturing milk is far older than nutrition labels, supermarkets, and modern wellness trends. And this is also a good reminder that there was never one universal monastery diet. A community in the Mediterranean could eat very differently from one in Northern Europe. Climate mattered, agriculture mattered, local customs mattered, and religious rules mattered. The real story isn't that monks discovered one perfect menu. It's that different communities learned how to build satisfying meals from whatever their environment could provide. And now we're entering the top 5. The next food takes us back to something much sweeter. But unlike modern desserts, this sweet ingredient was valuable enough that people had good reason to use it carefully. And its story goes back far beyond the monastery kitchen. We've reached the top 5. And at number 5, we have something that might seem surprising on a list about traditional monastery foods. Honey. Yes, monks ate sweet foods too. But here's where the story gets interesting. For much of history, sweetness wasn't as constantly available as it is today. There were no supermarkets filled with candy, no soft drinks in every refrigerator, no packaged snacks designed to deliver sweetness from morning to night. Natural sweeteners such as honey were valuable ingredients, and that made them something to be used rather than endlessly consumed. A little honey could sweeten porridge, bread, fruit, or a simple drink. It could make an ordinary meal feel special without requiring an elaborate dessert. And that reveals an interesting difference between traditional food environments and the modern one. The lesson isn't that monks never ate sugar or sweet foods. They did. The interesting question is, how often did sweetness dominate the diet? Today, sweetness can appear almost everywhere. Breakfast, a drink, a snack, a dessert, another snack. You can go through an entire day surrounded by sweet flavors without even thinking about it. In traditional communities, access to concentrated sweeteners was often much more limited. Honey was an ingredient. It didn't have to become the foundation of the diet, and that distinction still matters today. Honey may be natural, but natural doesn't mean unlimited. The sugars naturally present in honey count as free sugars, and the World Health Organization recommends keeping free sugar intake below 10% of total daily energy, with further reduction to 5% or less providing additional health benefits. So the lesson isn't, honey is a miracle food. It's much more useful than that. Sweetness can have a place in a diet without becoming the diet. And perhaps that's what makes honey so interesting at number 5. It reminds us that traditional eating wasn't necessarily about eliminating enjoyable foods. It was about giving them a place, a little sweetness, not endless sweetness. And now we're getting very close to number 1, because the next food takes us back to something that grows naturally in abundance. And unlike honey, it could be eaten fresh, dried, cooked, or preserved. And its history stretches far beyond the monastery walls. At number 4, we have a fruit that could become much more than something you simply ate fresh. Grapes. If a monastery had access to vineyards, grapes could be incredibly useful. During harvest, they could be eaten fresh. But a large harvest didn't have to disappear when the season ended. Grapes could be dried into raisins, turning a short-lived fruit into something that could remain useful for much longer. And in a world without modern refrigeration, that was a major advantage. Imagine harvesting more grapes than your community could possibly eat in a few days. You have 2 choices: let them spoil, or find a way to make the harvest last. Traditional communities often chose the second, and that reveals a simple idea that appears throughout this entire list. Don't just ask what you can eat today. Ask what you can save for tomorrow. Grapes are also interesting nutritionally. Like many colorful fruits, they contain naturally occurring plant compounds that researchers continue to study. But that's not really the most fascinating thing about them. It's their versatility. One harvest could provide fresh fruit. It could provide raisins later in the year. And in regions where vineyards were established, grapes could also be transformed into other products rather than being used only as fresh fruit. One crop, multiple uses, minimal waste. And that was exactly the kind of thinking traditional food systems rewarded. Instead of constantly asking, what should we buy next? People often had to ask, how can we get the most from what we already have? That's a very different relationship with food. And now we're down to final 3. And here's where the entire list starts to come together. Because the last 3 foods aren't simply 3 more ingredients. They reveal something much bigger about the way traditional monastery kitchens were built, and why the overall pattern may matter more than any single food. At number 3, we come to a group of foods that may seem almost too small to matter. Herbs, parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, and countless other plants that could find a place in a monastery garden. They weren't usually the main part of the meal, but they could have an outsized effect on it. Think about a simple bowl of beans, vegetables, grains, or soup. The ingredients may be nutritious, but without much seasoning, the meal can become repetitive. Then you add a handful of fresh herbs. Suddenly, the aroma changes, the flavor changes, and the same basic ingredients can feel like an entirely different meal. That's an important lesson. Healthy food doesn't have to be boring food. Traditional cooks could create variety and flavor from small amounts of plants rather than depending entirely on rich sauces or heavily processed flavorings. And monastery gardens weren't necessarily just sources of food. In many communities, they were part of a much larger system. Some plants were grown for cooking, Others were used in traditional herbal practices. What was grown depended on the climate, the soil, local knowledge, and the traditions of that particular community. And we should be careful here. Just because a plant was used historically doesn't mean every traditional medicinal claim about it has been scientifically proven. But the gardens themselves reveal something fascinating. A monastery wasn't simply a place where people lived. For many communities, it was a small food system. They grew what they could. They used what they grew. They preserved what they could. And they found multiple purposes for ordinary plants. Nothing needed to be exotic to be useful. And herbs may be the perfect example. Tiny ingredients, outsized impact. A little plant could add flavor, variety, aroma, and character to an otherwise simple meal. And now we're down to the final two. But there's something you should notice before we continue. For most of this video, we've been looking for the secret food, the one ingredient that supposedly explains everything. What if we've been looking for the wrong thing? Because the next food reveals why these traditional meals could be surprisingly satisfying. And then, at number 1, we'll finally see the pattern that connects all 20 foods together. At number 2, we're looking at foods that are small enough to overlook, but powerful enough to change a simple meal. Nuts and seeds, walnuts, almonds, hazelnuts, and seeds such as flax, sunflower, or pumpkin seeds. By now, you may have noticed something. We've already encountered some of these foods in different forms. And that's intentional, because nuts and seeds reveal something important about the entire monastery food philosophy. A meal didn't have to be complicated to be complete. Think about a simple bowl of grains or porridge. Now add a handful of nuts or seeds. Suddenly, you've added richness, texture, healthy fats, some protein, fiber, and other nutrients. You haven't replaced the meal. You've simply built on it. And that's the pattern we've been slowly uncovering. A grain could provide the foundation. Legumes could add substance. Vegetables could bring variety. Herbs could bring flavor. Fruit could bring natural sweetness. And nuts or seeds could add another layer of nourishment. Different foods didn't have to compete with each other. They could complement each other. That's a very different way of thinking about food. Instead of searching for one ingredient that supposedly does everything, you build a meal from several ordinary ingredients that each bring something different. And there's another reason nuts and seeds were useful. Many can be stored for long periods, making them practical foods to keep available when fresh produce wasn't always abundant. Of course, they're energy dense, so more isn't automatically better. The lesson is balance. Small amounts can still play an important role. And look at where we've arrived. We started with barley, then oats, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, cabbage, onions, garlic, apples, walnuts, flaxseed, olive oil, bread, fermented foods, cultured dairy, honey, grapes, herbs, and now nuts and seeds. 20 foods, many different qualities. But one pattern keeps appearing. Simple foods, variety, moderation, seasonality, preservation, and meals built from ingredients that work together. So perhaps the monks weren't hiding one magical food from us after all. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. And that brings us to number 1. Because the final food isn't a rare ingredient. It isn't a superfood. It isn't something you need to order online. It's something so ordinary that you may not even think of it as part of a healthy aging strategy. And once you see why it deserves the number 1 spot, the entire list is going to make sense. And now we've reached number 1. But here's the twist. It's not one food. It's the seasonal garden. Think carrots, turnips, leeks, squash, peas, leafy greens, and whatever else could grow in the soil around a monastery. At first, that might sound like a disappointing answer. After all, you've spent this entire video waiting for the one mysterious food that supposedly held the secret to healthier aging. But that's exactly the point. There may never have been one magical food. The real advantage was the pattern. A monastery garden could provide different foods throughout the year. fresh greens when they were growing, root vegetables when the weather changed, fruit when the trees were producing, and foods that could be stored or preserved when fresh produce became scarce. The result wasn't one perfect ingredient. It was variety. Different foods brought different flavors, textures, and nutrients to the table. But there was something else just as important: consistency. These weren't foods someone ate once because they had suddenly been declared a superfood. They were foods that could become part of everyday life, season after season, year after year. And now look at the entire list: barley, oats, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, cabbage, onions, garlic, apples, walnuts, flaxseed, olive oil, whole grain bread, fermented vegetables, cultured dairy, honey, grapes, herbs, and seasonal vegetables. Different foods, different strengths, but they could all fit into the same bigger pattern. Simple ingredients: variety, moderation, seasonality, preservation, and consistency. None of them had to do everything. They worked together, and that's the part that's easy to miss. If you were hoping number one would reveal a secret ingredient that could magically make you healthier or help you live longer, here's the truth. The secret wasn't one food. It was the way many ordinary foods could become part of everyday life. And perhaps that's a lesson the monastery kitchen has to offer us today. Maybe eating well doesn't begin with finding something you've never heard of. Maybe it begins with looking differently at the simple foods you've been overlooking. You don't need every superfood. You don't need a complicated diet. And you don't need to reinvent every meal. Sometimes, the bigger difference comes from something much less exciting: eating a variety of simple foods, season after season, year after year. And perhaps the monks didn't know a secret we completely forgot. Perhaps they simply understood something we've made much more complicated than it needs to be. So let's go back to the question we started with. Did the monks really know some secret food that helped them live longer? After looking at all 20 foods, the answer may be more surprising than you expected. It probably wasn't about one magical ingredient. Not the perfect berry. Not the perfect grain. Not some forgotten plant that could somehow change everything. Instead, look at what keeps appearing throughout the list: barley, oats, lentils, beans, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, herbs, different foods, different qualities. But many of them shared something important. They were simple enough to grow, store, prepare, and eat regularly. And that's the part we often overlook. One meal rarely defines your diet. The food you return to again and again helps shape your everyday pattern. You don't need to completely transform your diet overnight. You don't need to discover 20 new superfoods. Sometimes, the bigger change comes from making slightly better choices more consistently. Adding more vegetables to a meal. Choosing whole grains more often. Including beans or lentils regularly. Adding nuts or seeds instead of reaching for a highly processed snack. None of those choices feels dramatic, but repeated over months and years, small habits can become part of the way you normally eat. And perhaps that's the most useful lesson we can take from these old monastery kitchens. The surviving food traditions don't point to one secret ingredient that explains everything. They point toward pattern, simple foods, variety, moderation, seasonality, preservation, and most importantly, consistency. The goal isn't to eat perfectly. It's to make nourishing choices often enough that they become normal. So now I'm curious about you. Which of these 20 monastery foods surprised you the most? Was it something you already eat regularly, or something you've never really thought about before? Let me know in the comments. Because sometimes the most powerful change isn't discovering something completely new. It's rediscovering something simple we've forgotten.